Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinells, and tonight I have a very special guest making his spooky ass debut. All the way, I don't know which part you're from, but he's from Mexico.
Yep. I'm from, I was born in a small town called Durango, and then I lived for a long time in Monterrey, Mexico, which is really close to Texas. So Monterrey is the closest to like an Americanized city that you'll find in Mexico.
All right, very good. And I'm going to allow him to say his own name because I'm sure I'll mess up the pronunciation.
Hi, my name is Christian Mancinas Garcia.
Yeah. Very good. And actually, so Christian and I go back a little bit of a ways because he's a theater guy, an actor, and let's see, what was it was Sideshow, right?
Sideshow was the first show that we did together, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then more recently, of course, Rock of Ages, which listeners to this show are familiar with because some of the cast has been on.
Mm-hmm.
And then
that was a fun episode, by the way. I was in the background listening to.
Yeah, you were one of the half naked people.
Yeah.
That was weird because like whoever was like sitting in the chair wasn't facing everybody changing, but I was.
Yes, I remember that.
So then there's like half naked people laughing and making comments, and I'm like trying to focus on running the board and everything here. Yeah, that was an unusual show, but a good one. But yeah, Christian, you played Stacey Jax.
Correct.
For people who are familiar with the show.
Yep.
And as I said to you then, and I'll say it again, he was so fucking funny.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
I was afraid. I was like, no, I'm supposed to be like the big funny character in the show, and he's going to totally steal the show. And he might have, but it's all right.
I don't think so.
He was good.
You were pretty hilarious yourself.
Oh, thanks.
I was a big fan of watching your scenes from the wings.
The reason I asked Christian to come by is because this is a subject that I've touched on before when I did a history of Halloween episode. But we're going to talk about the Day of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
But I figured, well, Christian, this is part of his culture.
Correct.
And it's really, I mean, we'd certainly heard about it here, but I think it's really only caught on like as it's in its own right here in America. I would say within the last 5 years, I've started seeing, decorations and like the sugar skull motifs and those kind of things popping up.
Yeah.
And now it's all over the place.
Correct. Well, it's it all comes with globalization and how more interconnected we are now. Because I think I'm old enough. We are from the generation that like we still remember days without the internet.
Yep.
So I actually grew up with this tradition of Dia de los Muertos as part of my culture. And nowadays, kids in Mexico are actually more enthusiastic about Halloween and actually going trick-or-treating and everything. So now they're lucky because now they have 3 days of celebration because they do Halloween on the 31st of October, just like people here do. But also the Mexican families that try to keep the traditions alive, they still celebrate Dia de los Muertos, which is actually, it should be Dias de los Muertos because it's actually celebrated in over 2 days. There's November the 1st, which is Dia de los Inocentes, the Day of the Innocent, which is dedicated specifically to deceased children, infants, like babies. And then November the 2nd is Dia de las Animas, or the Day of the Souls, which is for everybody, like everybody else, adults and things like that.
The reason we touched on it before in the history of Halloween episode that I did, I don't know how much you know about the history of Halloween, but the short version is that it was actually different pagan holidays that the Catholic Church kind of came through and said, okay, we'll stop celebrating this holiday because it's not Christian, but nobody wanted to give it up. And I do think it's interesting that even in Mexico and other places in the world, many cultures celebrated this kind of holiday about remembering the dead or something along those lines, something to do with the dead and the other side at this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that worked out, but
Yeah, and actually, the history also of Dia de los Muertos is very, very similar because it's also associated with the Catholic Church,
yeah,
and how they decided to synthesize the
Right.
traditions that they found in order to keep the people happy, but still convert them to their traditions. And that happened a lot in Mexico. As you know, Mexico is a fairly Catholic country. Like I remember growing up, the statistics were like probably 90% of the country were identified as Catholic, and nowadays it must be less than that because immigration, and all that.
sure,
But still, it's a very, very Catholic country, and the origin of Dia de los Muertos comes from pre-Columbian days, where the people from Mesoamerica, which Mesoamerica it's comprised of what is now Mexico and parts of the southern United States, like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. So people from Mesoamerica, from the central part of what is now Mexico, used to have a whole month of remembrance for their departed. And it all also depended on what type of death they had. That's why it was a whole month, because they had days dedicated to the warriors. They had days dedicated to the infants, children. That I guess that it's interesting that in every culture, like the death of infants it's a very powerful thing. So they always get a special celebration for them, right? And warriors also have their very special celebration. They kind of have the equivalent of a kind of like a Valhalla there in Mesoamerican cultures too. And then towards the end of that month of celebration, it came to like the rest of the people. And then when the Catholic Church comes and sees that that's what's going on in Mexico, they, of course, at first try to make it forceful, and it's like, you have to stop celebrating that. But of course the natives are like, no, that's my tradition, that's what I'm going to keep doing. And so the Catholic Church finds, quote unquote, middle ground, and it's when they institute this 2 days of celebration of the death of dead and the people that have departed.
Yeah. So that's the Catholic Church's MO basically in medieval times.
Yeah.
And the times of the explorers and everything. They just kind of went around saying, stop doing this. And then the people said, no, we like doing this. And they said, okay, do it, but you're doing it for Jesus now.
Yes. Which brings to mind something that's not specifically related to Dia de los Muertos, but it's a very interesting thing that I've always liked from the history of Mexico. You know how in Catholic churches there are always sculptures of their saints.
Yes.
Like Catholicism is very into saints and angels, which is another branches of Christianism are not so much into
there's
that.
no saints.
There's no saints. It's just Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit. Well, in Catholicism, we have all of these different images, and each church has their own patron saint, and that kind of stuff. So what happened in Mexico when the Spanish missionaries came and tried to educate the natives, they came with violence. It wasn't like a happy kind of assimilation. So what the natives decided to do was to just tell them, okay, we're going to do what you want us to do, but in fact, I'm going to keep worshiping my deity, just making you think that I'm worshiping yours. So in a lot of Mexican churches, especially like the older ones, the ones that were built during the time that the Spaniards were conquering the country little by little, if you crack open the statues of the saints, of the Catholic saints, you will find a statue of the local god from the native people, and that's very, very interesting. There's a lot of churches where researchers have had like X-rays or heat images of the statues of the saints, and there's
That's really interesting.
a pre-Columbian deity inside of that.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and that's something that's always fascinated me as a Mexican, is like how the natives were defiant in the face of this like superpower that was coming to assimilate them, and they knew that they didn't have a chance to like fight them off because these guys had the boomsticks.
Yeah.
So they just sort of like tricked them to think that they were doing what they were being told to.
That reminds me actually of voodoo.
Yeah.
Because voodoo is also very connected to Catholicism in the same way.
Yes.
They have the saints, different saints represent different of the Loa that they have, which are not quite gods, but kind of demigods. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's the same. It's just how native peoples from different parts of the world that has been conquered by other cultures decide to keep the spark of their own identity, even when they are forced to change their identity.
And someday when America gets conquered, hopefully far from now, but the way things are, who knows?
Who knows? Maybe
we'll hold on to Halloween in some way.
Correct. Maybe there'll be little images of Bart Simpson inside the images of whatever else they make us worship.
Yeah. So let me ask you this.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Day of the Dead, like, is it a big deal in Mexico?
Yes, it is a big deal, but it's also not quite the way it's been represented in the US, especially as of late. Because as you say, it's become something very popular, and it's become something kind of like cool and a little bit of a cultural appreciation / appropriation, which are two different things. Yes. I am a big fan of the first one, not a fan of the second one. The cultural appreciation part comes when Mexican American kids in school get to actually, I don't know, in like show and tell they can talk about this tradition of their ancestors and things like that, right? And then it goes all the way to the sexy sugar skull costume kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you felt about that.
Yeah, well, I'm like I say, I'm a big fan of appreciation, and then not a big fan of appropriation, but also I'm not that rabid defendant of the things like that, you know?
Well, listen, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I do know Christian. And I have a feeling if he found a sexy gringo lady, Gringa. Yeah, see? I would do something. In a sugar skull costume of some sort. I don't think he'd kick her out.
Oh, no. I wouldn't kick her out. I would probably just educate her a little bit.
He'd use that as his opening.
Exactly.
Oh, let me tell you.
Let me tell you about the history of my people.
Let me tell you what you're doing here.
Yeah. But you know what I mean by it is a big deal, but it's not the kind of big deal that's been done or represented here in the US. The thing that comes into mind is the Spectre movie, James Bond movie. You remember that? I
didn't see that one.
You didn't see that one, but you remember that part of the marketing for the movie was Daniel Craig with sort of like a skull makeup and things like that. Because in the beginning of the movie, one of his missions brings him to Mexico City in the middle of the celebration, and it was a big deal when it was being shot in Mexico City because they closed the Zócalo, which is the main square of the city, which is a huge section of Mexico City. Very active, a lot of businesses, a lot of offices, and they closed it off for the production. And some people in Mexico were really not happy with the government because, of course, they closed it off because they got a big pay from the studio. And And then they staged a big parade, the kinds of like really doesn't exist for this celebration. Like that kind of parade that you see in movies or like movies like Spectre or things like that. It's not quite like that. It's not just like people partying on the streets. It made it look more like Mardi Gras
Right.
in Mexico to me. In the movie, it looked a lot like Mardi Gras with skulls instead of like beads, you know.
Sure.
Which is not the case. There are places in Mexico that do have parades, but they are much more introspective. The skull is there. The symbols are there, but it's not like a huge party because the celebration of the commemoration of the Dia de los Muertos is much more of remembrance. It's much more of remembrance, more than partying. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. It is a big deal. It's just not a big party. There is a part of it that is the Mexican culture is very, very faces death with a lot of humor and sarcasm and things like that. But it's not just a Mardi Gras style parade.
Right.
You know? Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about some of like the things that we might think of as non-Mexican people that when we think of the Day of the Dead. So sugar skulls, for example. Can you explain?
Yeah. So the sugar skulls are usually placed in an altar during the 2 days of Dia de los Muertos, and these altares, we call them ofrendas, which is translated as offerings. The whole significance of this is that the departed would be visiting us those days, like the November the 1st and November the 2nd. The kids the children would come on November the 1st. The adults would come on November the 2nd. And usually what you put on the altar is water because they're going to be thirsty from the long journey that they take from the underworld. Pan de muerto, we call it pan de muerto, which is just a sweet kind of bread baked with like sugar and raisins, and it's kind of a sweet kind of bread for food, oranges, things like that. And then originally, like in the original type of celebration, the altars would actually have the skulls of the people that they were dedicated to. Like in pre-Columbian times, they would keep the skulls of their loved ones and they would put them there. So that, of course, was not a passable thing for the Catholic Church, because for the Catholic Church, you have to bury your dead, right? So that's when it became the sugar skull, and it usually has the name of the person written with like a sugary kind of thing. I'm not a confectionery, so I don't know about these things, how they're made, but it's basically just colored sugar used to write the name of the person that the altar is being dedicated to on the forehead of the sugar skull. So it's basically representing who the person that's being honored was, you know. And then besides the skull with the name of the person and the bread and the water, there are flowers with the typical flower of Dia de los Muertos is called cempasúchil, which is a kind of marigold. It's the orange marigold flower.
Sure.
And the reason we use that flower is because originally, with like having skulls there, and if the person hadn't been dead for a long time, there was always weird smells and things like that, right? So the cempasúchil flower is a very aromatic, very pungent flower, so it would serve to disguise the smells, the stench of
So it
rotten
had a
flesh and
practical
bone.
use.
Yeah, it had a practical use, and things like that used to happen also, like in medieval times during the Black Plague and things like that. I don't know if you know it, like asylums and hospitals back then would just like be covered in flowers, and they would be like beautiful to look at, but it was just because the stench of sickness and death
Yeah.
was so terrible that you had to cover everything in flowers. So that's also the use of the cempasúchil flower in Dia de los Muertos offerings. And then on top of that, there was also the custom originally, like if the altar was for a warrior, for an Aztec warrior, they would place their weapons there. Or if it was for a woman that she was fond of, like, I don't know, making tortillas on her like stone thing where they like just crush the corn and things like that. They would put the tools of the trade of that person
Sure.
on the altar, right? So nowadays we like put there, I don't know if it's a kid who passed away, I don't know, their favorite toys or things that they used to play with, and the same with adults, like sometimes they put tequila in there, or like whatever their favorite beer used to be when they were alive, and things like that. So that was a very roundabout way of explaining
No, I
what the
think that's
sugar
good,
skull
so-
is about,
Right.
but it's just a tiny part of the whole
altar that you would
offering
have.
altar. You know what I mean? But the thing is that it's such a visually stunning thing. It can be so simple, just like a white sugar skull with a name on it, or it can be super complicated, and that's what's really, really cool. Like there are some places in the south of Mexico where those things are like literal pieces of art that are gonna melt because they're
Yeah.
made of sugar. And it's also a very interesting reminder of how like temporary things are, you know, because it's just like making sandcastles. It's
Right.
just making such a beautiful sugar skull. It's something that's gonna either get eaten or just disappear after a while because it's sugar, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's
Well, and I can
where it comes
imagine. I would imagine it's true. It would be true in America, and I bet it's true anywhere in the world.
from.
If someone does like a super awesome sugar skull, the neighbor's like, "Well, I better step up my game,"
Yeah,
and then you just have people like
yeah.
getting more and more creative with what they're doing.
Exactly. So I remember as a child in school when I was growing up, we were always encouraged to bring our own things to, like, each school would create their own altar. And since it's not a specific family, right? It's not for a specific person. So the school would pick a historical figure every year to dedicate the altar to, right? And I remember, I think my elementary school ones did, like, the one that I remember specifically is for Albert Einstein, and I remember it specifically because I didn't know who he was at the time. I think I was like in second grade or something like that.
Mm.
So I went and read about him, and that's when I found out who Albert Einstein was, and I was like 6 or 7 years old. So kids are encouraged to bring their own, like, drawings of skulls, of sugar skulls. Like, of course, a 6-year-old's not gonna be able to make one of those. And the whole point of schools having that tradition is to encourage creativity from the students, right? So it was about drawings. Another tradition that happens for Dia de los Muertos that is not known at all here in the U.S., it's what we call calaveras, which just translates as skulls, which are like poems, funny poems mocking someone that's alive, but sort of like narrating what would happen when they die, like how they would go, how would death come for them, and the like funny hijinks that they could do to try to avoid death and things like that. So that's another thing that we as kids were encouraged to bring, like calaveras for the specific person that the offering was being made for. And of course, like little poems written by, more like rhyme songs written by kids, you know?
like a limerick
Mhm.
kind of thing.
Kind of thing. Exactly.
Yeah. So, aside from the altar and maybe those activities in school, like
Mhm.
what do you do to actually celebrate the Day of the Dead or
Yeah.
Days of the Dead?
Of course. So the most important part of it comes the actual day, either November the 1st or the 2nd, is to go to the cemetery and clean the grave of your family member or whoever you were honoring that day. Clean it up, wash things, bring some offerings to the grave itself, not just like from the altar, bring some of them to the grave itself. Because the thought is that they come from the underworld, they go through all of this journey, like this huge journey, and they come back to the world through the grave. Like, so the cemetery is where they will come into the world through, and then find their way to the altar at home. There are actually some towns, some families in Mexico that would make a bed next to the altar. Like, they would place the altar next to a bed that would be made and left empty, because the idea is that they need to rest because they have the same journey
Sure.
to go on the other way around, right?
Now, not to interrupt, but
Mhm.
just out of curiosity, are people doing this more out of tradition, or do they literally still believe that these spirits might come?
So by now, I think that nowadays a lot of it is mainly tradition, but I do think that there are still a lot of people, especially in smaller rural parts of Mexico, that actually think that this is something that happens. And in preparation for this, I was today at work, and I had videos about Day of the Dead on the background, just like sort of like listening and trying to refresh my memory. And there's a very interesting one from the BBC, where this guy, it's a show from the BBC called Feasts, where this guy just travels around the world to analyze different celebrations in different cultures, right? And there's one specifically in Mexico, and he looks at two different things. He looks at a quinceañera, and then he looks at Day of the Dead, and all of that is in like the course of like 5 days that he spent in Mexico. And he spends most of the time for Dia de los Muertos with this specific family, and there's a point where they are just like sort of waiting. Just everything has been done. They've gone to the cemetery to clean the graves and everything. So they are just now at home, at this family's home, waiting for it. And the woman like literally says like, "Did you see that? Did you see how the door moved? How the wind made like a rustle with the leaves and things like that? That means that he's here." And they're waiting on her granddad. So there's people that literally still think that that show is not recent. It's probably from like 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, but I wouldn't be surprised. Like
Yeah.
there's definitely people here who believe in ghosts and
Yeah,
those kinds
definitely.
of things. So it's not any different.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to imply that. Not saying, oh, those poor Mexicans, they don't understand. No, I don't mean that. I meant like overall, do people believe
Yeah,
or do
there's a lot of people that still think that. I know for a fact that my grandmother was of the belief that the spirits of our departed were coming back. So some of my favorite memories actually growing up, my grandmother on my mom's side, I never met my grandmother on my father's side, but my granny on my mom's side, she passed away when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. So I don't have that many memories with her, but some of my favorite ones are of the Dia de los Muertos, where a couple of my cousins and I would spend the night at my grandmother's house and then go with her to the cemetery the next day. And we would, of course, we were like kids and we were there to sort of like have fun in a
Sure.
kind of way. which can be done because outside the cemetery there was like this big carnival. Like there were like food stalls and candy stalls, like the a stall where they would make the sugar skulls and sell them to you. Like right there, you would look at them, watch them make them, and cotton candy. Usually, like a couple of mechanical rides, not a lot because it wasn't like this big party, but there was usually like maybe merry-go-round and things like that, right? So we would go there with my grandmother, and my cousins and I would just like run around the stalls outside the cemetery for a little while. My grandmother would buy us like these huge bags of shelled peanuts. Like I think they're called circus peanuts here in the U.S. when they are like in the shell still.
Well, it's probably just shelled peanuts, but circus peanuts is like a type of candy here.
Oh, gotcha.
That nobody
then
likes.
Never mind.
Yeah.
Then the shelled peanuts, like actual bags with peanuts, an orange, and candy, of course, right? So we wanted the candy, like that's what we wanted,
right?
And the orange, the sellers of these things, they would always put an orange in there because they would tell you like, I mean, here's your bag of candy and peanuts and an orange. And what are we going to do with the orange? Like, we're going to bring it to the grave. So we would actually like bring an orange to the grave. Because as a kid, you don't really care for the orange. All you want is the candy, right? Yeah. So yeah, those are some really nice memories I have with my grandmother of just going to the cemetery. And then afterwards, as I became like a teenager and started doing the same thing with my mom, of course, it became more of an actual like remembrance kind of tradition. Sure. It's when you become more aware, and I guess also that the passing away of my grandmother kind of like connected me to that tradition a little bit, in a little bit of a more of a deeper way, you know?
Sure.
Because as a kid, you're celebrating. You're celebrating, but you don't really understand what or why, you know. But then once someone that you love and that is close to you actually passes away, then you understand what this is about, and then you give the importance that the other person used to give to the cleaning of the grave and the setting of the flowers and the setting of the bread and the water and the drink, you know. Yeah.
Now you're making me feel guilty because I remember my mom saying that she wanted people to visit her grave and do these things, and I do go out there once in a while, but not. I wouldn't even say once a year. Like just sometimes I do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I feel kind of bad. I should go do that. Maybe on November 2nd I will.
You should. It would be a nice tradition to start. But then again, it's just a very different. I think this is a very interesting way of pointing out the difference between Latin culture and like Anglo-Saxon culture, is how we Latin American people are we don't let go of things, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that Anglo-Saxon people sometimes let go of things too much because it's kind of scary and it weighs you down. But then on the flip side of the coin with Latin American cultures is we don't let go enough, and sometimes it also weighs you down. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's kind of a weird dichotomy that we have.
So going back, I'm thinking about the kind of carnival atmosphere you talked about outside the cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
Now, are there any like pockets or some people that maybe think that might be disrespectful? Given that it's supposed to be like a remembrance holiday?
No, I think that as long as it stays outside of the cemetery. And the thing with this is another thing with cemeteries back there in Mexico. There's in England and in the US, there's a lot of cemeteries are like open, you know. Like they're just like you can just walk in and you can see them from the road. there are no gates, or sometimes, especially in the smaller towns here around Massachusetts, they're just there, right? They're just like they're either in the backyard of a church, or they're just like a huge hill, and there's no gate, no nothing.
Right.
In Mexico, they are always gated. There's always a separation. There's always a, I know you're there, but I don't want to look at you directly, you know? And it also comes maybe from this very weird way that in cemeteries in Mexico, the tombstones are not just a tombstone, like a slab of rock or marble or whatever. They're usually like sculptures. Sometimes they're creepy. I remember the cemetery that most of my family is, that most of the like people that have passed away from my family are. It has one specific tomb that's for a woman that was a nurse, and it has this like bust of the woman on her nurse attire, but it was painted like, as you know how now we know that Romans used to, like, the
Right.
Roman sculptures that we see in museums that are like all white marble.
Right.
When they were actually up in Roman times, they were painted.
Right.
They were like painted with
Crazy
actual crazy
Technicolor
colors
stuff,
and things like that. So that thing was painted, I remember, for a while. Nowadays it's white also, because like people just, I guess that the people that like her family members just decided to just let it go. But I remember that for a long time I was afraid of nurses, because I remember going to that cemetery and just like looking at that sculpture, and it was so, it had the eyes without the like the iris, the pupil, you know. So it was so impactful to my
I was
tiny
gonna
little
say,
brain.
I can see where there's like a connection made there.
Yeah.
that's-
So for a while I was afraid of nurses in that kind of uniform, you know. So that's the kind of thing that happens with cemeteries in Mexico, is that they always have these gates, they always have walls or separation, because it's kind of hard to look at them, because especially if you're like walking around at night. If you walk around at night in the cemetery around here, it's, I guess that you can get the feeling of like the weight of the fact that there's hundreds of years of people entered there, right? But it's still just slabs of stones with names. Over there, it's like you see a nurse, and then you see like creepy angels, and then you see saints, and there's a lot of the I don't know if you know the image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Yep.
Which is like Jesus with his heart out.
Right.
And the heart has thorns itself. Like Jesus has the crown of thorns, but the heart also has a crown of thorns on it. That's a very popular image in Mexico, the Sacred Heart. So there's a lot of tombstones that have either like an image of the Sacred Heart, or an actual like sculpture representation of it.
Yeah.
So that's a really
I can imagine.
weird thing to look at night, you know?
I was raised Catholic, so I know all these
Oh, yeah,
images. Yeah, but for those of you who don't know the Sacred Heart, it's not like a horror image in the sense that like it's not like he's opening his rib cage and you see like, you know, it's just like this. It's usually kind of surrounded in like a black, and it's you know, it's very pretty in its own way actually.
Yeah,
But as a kid, you do kind of think of it as like I'm seeing into Jesus's body, and there's like this
Yeah.
crazy ass heart with a crown and thorns, and
Jesus is usually represented like looking up and sort of a little bit in pain, which is like the agony of
Right.
the crucifixion in the Sacred Heart image. So it's always it's always creeped me out. Of course, now as an adult, I don't give it the second thought anymore. But as a kid, and at my grandmother's house, in the living room, there was like this huge poster of the Sacred Heart, like center stage in the living room.
Yeah.
That was like the piece that tied the living room together, right?
Yeah.
So I remember just like not liking that image. It was it was too much for
Yeah.
my brain.
my grandmother had actually my grandfather
Mhm.
was an artist, an amateur artist, but he was very talented actually. but in her bedroom, when I was growing up, she had a painting that he had done
Mm-hmm.
of Jesus and the Sacred Heart.
Gotcha.
And that it was the same kind of thing. Like I'd look at it and be like, I don't know about this. It sounds like when Americans want to think of it, we kind of want to picture it more like Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
But there is, you correct me if I'm wrong, is there like a dressing up aspect to it at all?
So, yes, especially for kids, but it is Halloween. And that's the thing nowadays. Even as I was growing up, I remember that Halloween and Dia de los Muertos kind of like became one same thing. You know, so now kids nowadays, they do have the whole dressing up and going out for trick-or-treating on the night of Halloween. But then the days that is dedicated to Dia de los Muertos, it's not really about dressing up. Although some smart kids, they go trick-or-treating 3 days instead of just one, you know? So they do dress up on November the 1st and on November the 2nd, and they go trick-or-treating. But I don't think it's like, it's more of an assimilation of two cultures now.
Yeah.
But there is a very specific like separation of what both are. And we do call it Halloween. Like,
right.
Mexico has become very like Americanized in some ways. It's a very strange thing that we have because we want to maintain our traditions and like our identity, but also love Starbucks and watching How I Met Your Mother and things like that, you know? So that's the same thing that's happening with Halloween and Dia de los Muertos, which is now a 3-day kind of festivity that involves both one specifically geared towards the kids and then the one that's for the adults that's more of a keeping up with the tradition of our Mexicanity and our families, right? And it's really interesting because it's really cool to watch how kids at first have no interest whatsoever on the second one, but then as they grow up and probably as they lose some family members or just become more conscious of what being a person and the fact that we're all gonna die, as they become more conscious about that, they start to like slowly gravitate towards the second one too and still like thread both for a while.
It sounds like this is really a kind of family oriented event. So like, would you throw a Day of the Dead party that would be for like outside the family, or would it just be a family gathering kind of thing?
It's usually a family gathering kind of thing. And I remember, so one of the things that on the night of November the 2nd usually that happens is that you get to eat the pan de muerto, the bread. You get to eat the offerings. If sometimes people like cook whole meals as offerings, and then you get to eat them the night of November the 2nd. So I remember at least once that happening at my grandmother's house. Like November the 2nd, it's the night, and then we start eating the offerings, and we start just like hanging out as family and sort of like remembering the person that we are honoring, right? So it's more of a family thing, but also it's one of those where like the doors are open, and if there's a friend that wants to come,
sure,
they're welcome. But it's not like an actual party that's announced and people just come and show up, right? Because everybody else is also like with their families, you know?
So what you're saying is you wouldn't paint your face up like a sugar skull and wear a sombrero and drink tequila and all those kinds of things that you might see on like a sitcom if they were like, oh.
I would do that on the 31st.
You're right.
And then not do that on the 1st and the 2nd.
Yeah.
But then again, like there are, like I said, there are some places in Mexico where people do dress up as, like they do wear that makeup and they dress up as mariachis or like charros, which is like our version of a cowboy. And they go out and they have parades, and it's a very impressive thing, especially in southern parts of Mexico. There's also another beautiful, beautiful tradition in the state of the state of Michoacan, which is a southern state. It has a coast with the Pacific Ocean, so it's in the southwest of Mexico. There's this little island in a lake that's called Pátzcuaro. There's a lake in that state, and that lake has a little island in the middle, and then the people of that island on Dia de los Muertos, they don't have like a cemetery. They just get on their boats, and they have their altar and their offerings on their like family boats. So all you see at night is just a lot of candles surrounding the island, and it's just amazing. It's just incredible. I've never actually like witnessed it in person. I've been to Pátzcuaro, and actually the island I think is called Zitácuaro. So sorry about the bad memory, but I've been to that island, and it's beautiful. It's one of those each house is painted a different color, like super bright pink, super bright blue, things like that. So I can only imagine how impressive that must be. And there's a lot of videos online. Like if you look for that on YouTube, you're gonna find some videos, and I think that some of them are produced by the BBC, and it's just a beautiful like postcard of some of the most cool traditions that come from this celebration.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about it now. Like I don't want to speak for all Americans, but in my family, we don't really have days where we sit around and talk about our loved ones that have passed. It comes up at family events and stuff that'll happen here and there, but there's not like a day set aside for it. And I kind of think that's too bad because, unfortunately for me, I am a member of the oldest generation of my family.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, like, my mom and dad have both passed away. My aunts and uncles in my immediate family have passed away. Extended family, we've got some older folks, but, you know, the people who could tell the stories about grandma and grandpa and even my mom and dad are gone, you know. And especially my dad died when I was very young. I was 6 years old. I don't have a ton of memories of him. And I had bits and pieces given to me here and there about, you know, what kind of guy he was like and all that kind of stuff. But I wish that we had sat around and told more stories and those kind of things. And I enjoy telling my nieces and nephews about their grandmother, you know. So I think that's something we Americans, or at least this American family of mine, should look into. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting and worthy holiday.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'm a like as a Mexican living in the U.S., I do have a lot of nostalgia for my country. I do love living here, and I want to live here, and I want to stay here. But these type of traditions are the type of things that help me stay bonded. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And it's also really cool just to like as a citizen of the world, but that's originally from Mexico, to see that elements from your culture and things that you grew up with are now like cool. You know, it's just like it's like you and I are both like big nerds, so it's always
speak for yourself. That's cool.
It's always cool like now to see how now it's not nerdy to like superheroes. Now it's like actually cool to like superheroes or like things like that, you know. So that I get that sort of same feeling now, but from my whole culture when like I remember being very excited about the James Bond movie because I'm a big fan of James Bond, and then when they started marketing Spectre with like a very heavy Dia de los Muertos concept, I was like, whoa, that's amazing. It was a little bit disappointing, but it was still cool to see Mexico City being portrayed in such a like cool movie and like being used in a cool way. So yeah, I like the fact that this culture is spreading. And you mentioned that it's taking a lot of speed in the last few years, the last 5 to 10 years probably.
Yeah.
But it's actually been, especially in communities like Chicago or in parts of Arizona and like Texas, and like New Mexico, where there's always been a big Mexican population, and they are Mexican, and I call this population is interesting, especially in New Mexico. There's a big chunk of people in New Mexico that they were Mexicans when New Mexico was Mexico. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they are of Mexican descent, but they have always lived there. So they are rightfully Americans because now that's America, but they are also rightfully Mexican because their families were there when that was Mexico. So those cultures, those cultural clashes there are very interesting. And those people have always celebrated Dia de los Muertos, and that's how it's always been around. You know, it's always been around in the U.S. It's always been a thing in places like San Diego, Chicago, Tucson, Arizona.
Yeah,
like
I mean,
that.
you know, I'd always heard about it
Yeah.
and stuff like that, and I knew sugar skulls and that kind of thing. But to see like decorations being sold specifically for Day of the Dead, or at least a sugar skull motif, which might not be used for Day of the Dead. People might just be like, "Oh, we're gonna put this up as like a Halloween decoration because it's a really cool looking skull." You know, not fully understanding or probably caring, honestly, but not. I don't mean that in like a super negative way, but just not
just
knowing. You see it and
out of ignorance.
they're beautiful, and you're like, "Oh, that's really interesting and cool," and I want to use that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, the first time I remember seeing sugar skulls displayed in a very prominent way in a very prominent cultural property. It's Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. The third movie was directed by Alfonso Cuarón, who is a Mexican director. And I don't know if you remember, there's a scene where Harry Potter sneaks out of... He doesn't have permission to leave. I don't know if you know about Harry Potter.
To be honest with you, I'm not a huge Harry Potter guy. I actually did see this movie in the theater with a group of friends when it came out because they all wanted to go.
Gotcha.
What's up, Jen? But that's the last time I saw it.
Gotcha.
So.
Well, there's this part of the story where he wants to go on a field trip, but he doesn't have permission. So he sneaks out wearing his invisibility cloak, and he walks into the candy shop at the town that's like close to Howard's, right? So as soon as he walks into the candy shop, the first thing that you see on display is a bunch of sugar skulls. And I remember seeing that at the movie theater and just like going nuts about it because like that's so cool. It's like a very cool way from Cuarón, the director, to say, hey, I'm Mexican and this is my culture, and it's cool. Like let's give it a boost.
Yeah.
And then afterwards there's just gotten more and more attention from the world, and it's always very nice and heartwarming to see all of these images pop up all the way over here, things that I grew up with.
Yeah. Well, listen, like I said, it sounds like I might have to get into this a little bit more. And I know Massachusetts is maybe not the best place in the world to get Mexican food, but I think you should take me somewhere that...
I know exactly where I'm going to take you. I don't know. Can I say?
Go ahead.
Where
I'm sure they'd be very happy that you promote them.
As a Mexican in Massachusetts, my favorite place to eat actual Mexican food is this little restaurant in Somerville called Tu y Yo, which is right by the Powder House Square. But yeah, it's a really nice, really good Mexican restaurant.
All right, I'm going to take you up on that. We're going to go soon.
Yeah, let's go together.
All right.
I'm always looking for an excuse to go there.
Yeah. All right, so I guess we're done talking about the Day of the Dead. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it correctly in Spanish. I didn't even take Spanish in high school. I took French.
Gotcha.
Not that I can speak that any better than I can speak Spanish.
I took French 1 semester too, and I don't remember anything.
No, I took it for 3 years. But I do remember Mon Frere and Je m'appelle Eric.
Cool.
That's about the extent of it. But this was really nice. This was, I mean, usually when we're hanging out, we're talking theater or what so-and-so did backstage or where we're going to go for the cast party or something. So
Yep.
this was nice to have this opportunity to sit down and chat with you and learn more. I invite you all to check out this show's website. It is at spookyassshit.com or spookyas.com. They both take you to the same place. That is the show's blog page. From there, you can listen to this episode, every episode that we've ever done. Sometimes find outtakes. I bet this show will have some. Oh yeah, we're over an hour now in real recording time, which is totally fine. It just means there might be some outtakes for people to discover
Cool.
on the website. And you can also find pictures from every episode, just about every episode. And you can find links to our social media. We are at spookyassshit on Instagram and on Twitter. And you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. So, Christian, once again, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I think we've all learned a lot today, and I think you were a good representative of your country.
I hope so. I hope that any Mexicans listening to this don't hate me and don't think that I butchered everything.
If you said something wrong, you write in and let us know. But you get my stamp of approval. This is a good hombre.
That's all I ever wanted.
All right. So please remember to share the show, tell your friends, and let's keep growing that way. And eventually, maybe we can do a live show, and then Christian and I can come out and rock the house.
I'll be down for that.
Yeah, face to face with everyone prowling that stage. I keep telling these people it's nice to listen to me here, but really, my natural environment is the stage. So we gotta get people. We gotta get a big enough crowd that we can start doing those shows. All right then. Until next time. Enjoy the Day of the Dead if you celebrate, and if you don't celebrate, maybe you should start. So that's November 1st and 2nd. So it's called the Day of the Dead, but you get two. It's a two-for deal. And of course, if it hasn't passed yet, Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, everyone.
Until next time, don't be afraid.